Welcome back, friends. Pour yourself something to drink, get comfortable, because today's talk is one I put together a long time ago, back in the early days when I was speaking to service clubs, and every once in a while to a high school class or a college classroom. It's one of the simplest talks I ever gave, and honestly, it's held up better than almost anything else I've written over the years. I want to share it with you now, the way I've shared it so many times over the years. I call it the 4 ifs that make life worthwhile. If you've ever found yourself wondering what actually separates a life that feels rich and full from one that just quietly passes by, these 4 little words might be exactly what you've been looking for. Stick with me through all 4, because each one builds on the last, and by the end, I think you'll see how they all fit together into a single, simple philosophy. Here's the first if. Life becomes worthwhile if you learn. You've got to know. You've got to have the information. Whenever I talk to young people in school, this is exactly what I tell them. Get the information while you're there. What you decide to do with it afterward, that's entirely up to you. Throw it all away later if you want. That's your choice. Use just a little of it. That's your choice too. But while you're there, in that classroom, gather all of it you possibly can, because there's nothing worse than being uninformed. Being broke is bad, sure, but being uninformed is far worse. So gather the information. What's really rough is being broke and uninformed at the same time. There's not much worse than that combination. So write this down. What you don't know will eventually hurt you. Not knowing something isn't a peaceful, blissful state. Not knowing is often where real tragedy hides. Not knowing leads to poor health decisions. Not knowing leads to devastation. Not knowing leads to going broke. Not knowing quietly creates a smaller, harder life than the one you could have had. So you've got to know. You've got to gather the information, wherever you can find it. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Most people don't set out to remain uninformed. It rarely happens on purpose. It happens through neglect, through putting off the reading, through skipping the class, through assuming they'll figure it out later when the pressure is on. But later has a way of arriving faster than we expect, and showing up completely unprepared for a moment that mattered is one of the most avoidable forms of regret there is. So don't wait for later. Start gathering the information now, while the stakes still feel manageable and the lesson is still cheap. The first way to learn is through your own personal experience. One honest way to eventually get something right is to first get it wrong and learn from the mess. That doesn't mean your life is over. It just means you clean things up and do it better the next time, using that negative experience as fuel. Sometimes it's the difficult, painful experiences that end up saving our lives and setting us up for real success. Think about it this way. People often say that if you survive your very first serious health scare, you might go on to live a long, full life. Why would that be true? Because that first scare acts as a wake-up call. Maybe the doctor sits you down and says, "One more like that," and it could be the end. And suddenly you think, "Wow, I need to change." So you start eating better. You start reading everything you can find on health and nutrition. You start exercising, walking, moving your body again. And all of that change, sparked by one hard wake-up call, could very well be the reason you go on to live a long and healthy life. So learn from your negative experiences, and just as much, learn from your positive ones too. Here's the next way to gather real knowledge. Learn from other people's experiences. That's kake. It's how you become wiser in a much shorter amount of time than starting completely from scratch. Someone out there has already lived through a hard 5-year stretch, and maybe they wrote a book about what they learned. That book might save you those same 5 years, and it probably costs you very little to read it. That kind of education is simply too valuable to pass up. Best to gather the information ahead of time, before disaster strikes. Yes, we can recover from almost anything. Yes, we can come back from financial ruin. Yes, we can come back from poor health, from setbacks that feel like they've buried us completely. But how much better would it be if we had gathered that wisdom early and avoided some of those hard years altogether? Think about how much time gets wasted simply because 2 people, in 2 entirely different corners of the world, both had to learn the exact same hard lesson, the exact same slow, expensive way, purely because neither one ever read the book, or sat down with the mentor, or asked the right question of someone who already knew the answer. That's not a small loss. Multiply that across a whole lifetime, across every difficult lesson you could have shortened, simply by paying attention to someone else's story, and you start to see just how much value is sitting there, freely available, waiting for anyone willing to go looking for it. So learn from other people's experiences, both the painful ones and the successful ones. I've often said something a bit playful in my talks. Too bad the people who've truly failed at life don't hold seminars of their own. Nobody wants to pay to hear from them, so they never get the invitation, even though their information could honestly be some of the most valuable out there. If someone has spent 40 years quietly wrecking their own life, imagine sitting down with them and saying, "Would you spend a whole day with me? I'll bring a notebook and take careful notes. You had every advantage, good looks, a wonderful family, every reason in the world to succeed, and somehow you let it all slip away. Teach me exactly how that happened, so I can make sure it never happens to me." That's the value of learning from someone else's hard lessons, even the ones nobody wants to celebrate. It sounds a little humorous when you put it that way, but there's real truth buried in it. We tend to seek out the success stories, and that's not wrong. There's plenty to learn there too. But the cautionary stories, the ones people would rather forget, often carry lessons just as valuable, sometimes more valuable, because they show you exactly which turns to avoid in vivid, specific detail. So learn from your own experience, and learn from other people's experience too. If you learn, genuinely learn, life becomes worthwhile. Here's the second if. Life becomes worthwhile if you try. Once you've learned something, you have to actually attempt to put it into practice. We touched on this idea earlier too. Take real action. You truly never know what's possible until you try. My own father used to say exactly that. You never know until you try. Picture setting a bar 2 feet off the ground and asking a group of kids to jump over it. What happens? Some will say, "No way, I can't do that." Others will say, "Easy, no problem at all." Some genuinely won't know either way. So how do we actually find out? Everybody has to take a real run at it and see whether they clear that 2-foot bar. You've got to try it to know for sure. And what if you knock the bar down on your first attempt? Does that mean you're simply incapable of jumping 2 feet? Of course not. So what do? You try again. Maybe somebody shows you a small adjustment. Leave the ground just a touch earlier. Shift your weight slightly. And before you know it, 2 feet feels effortless, when just moments earlier you weren't sure you could manage it at all. Here's what I find fascinating about this whole idea of trying. Most of us already know, deep down, roughly what we're capable of, if only we'd give ourselves the chance to find out. But we talk ourselves out of the attempt before we even get to the starting line. We imagine failure so vividly that we save ourselves the trouble of actually experiencing it. And in doing so, we also rob ourselves of the far more common outcome, which is simply learning something useful and getting a little better. Trying isn't really about guaranteeing success. It's about gathering real information about yourself that no amount of imagining could ever give you. I remember this lesson firsthand with public speaking. At 25 years old, I stood up to give my very first little talk, and my mind essentially sat back down without me. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. My knees were knocking together. Sweat was pouring down my face. That, my friends, is called terror, in case you've never experienced it firsthand. But somehow, I stumbled through it. It was rough, genuinely rough. If it hadn't been a required part of the class I was taking, I probably would have walked straight out the door. I'm honestly glad none of you were sitting in that room, because you certainly wouldn't have paid a single dollar for that first performance. But I made it through, and then I did it again. Honestly, I wasn't even sure I should try a second time. Thankfully, I had a mentor, a teacher who told me something simple but powerful. He said, "That's nothing to worry about. If you step up to bat and strike out, does that mean the game is over for you? No. It just means that particular time at bat didn't go your way. Then you get another turn, and another, and eventually you start connecting. Eventually you get good enough to do well consistently. Eventually you get good enough to help your team win. And eventually you get good enough to take home the trophy. So you simply keep trying." Here's the third if that makes life genuinely worthwhile. Life becomes worthwhile if you stay. You've got to hang in there through the hard stretches. Some people plant their seeds in spring, and then walk away entirely by summer, right when things get a little hot, a little uncomfortable, right when it looks like the weeds, chemery might be winning, and the insects are having a feast on everything you planted. That's exactly when people tend to say, "I've had enough of this." But here's the key. If you want any kind of harvest come fall, you've got to stay through the whole summer. Even if that particular harvest doesn't turn out as well as you'd hoped, you see it through anyway, and you use everything you learned to plant even better the next time. The seasons turn around again, so stay in it. If you've chosen to play the game, you stay until it's finished. Imagine being on a team, badly behind on the scoreboard, and deciding, we're so far behind, we're just going to walk off the court right now. People would run you out of town for that. Nobody would want you representing their team ever again. Being behind doesn't mean you leave. It means you stay until the game reaches its actual end. We're not talking about your whole life here, just this particular game, this particular season, this particular commitment. If you're in it, you stay until it's over. Think about the people who leave a stadium early as mere spectators, simply because their team happens to be behind. What if the players themselves adopted that same attitude? We're behind, so we're heading out. Who are the people pushing past you, spilling their popcorn and their drink down your shoulder, rushing toward the exit before the final whistle? They're usually the ones proudly saying, we're beating the traffic. And sure, that might be one of life's small, practical skills, beating the traffic home. But it's a strange thing to prioritize over standing by your own team when they need you most. No, if you've signed up for something, you don't have to attend every single event forever, but the one you commit to, you see all the way through. You don't have to do everything every single time, but once you've started something, follow it through to its natural conclusion. See the season through completely. After that, if you decide not to plant again, that's entirely your choice. But when you do commit to something, go the full distance. There's a quiet kind of dignity in staying, one that people don't always notice from the outside. Anybody can show up on the easy days, when the sun is shining and the early results look promising. The real test comes in the middle stretch, when the excitement has worn off, the weeds are thick, and there's no visible proof yet that any of it is going to pay off. That middle stretch is where most people quietly slip away, and it's exactly why the ones who stay end up standing so far ahead of everyone else by the time harvest finally arrives. Staying isn't glamorous. It rarely gets applauded in the moment, but it's almost always the thing that separates the people who eventually succeed from the galaka who simply meant to. I think of a man I once knew who was excellent at laying foundations, but who would then simply walk away, never putting up the walls, never adding a roof, never actually finishing what he started. He had unfinished foundations scattered across the entire country. I once asked a friend of mine, Jim, what exactly are you good at? And he answered honestly, starting things over. That's really my specialty. If something doesn't work right away, I just don't stick around very long. And I remember thinking, no, that's not the way. See it through. Life becomes genuinely worthwhile when you learn to stay, to hang in there through the difficult middle stretch of any real commitment. And now, here's the fourth and final if. Life becomes worthwhile if you truly care. This is exactly how I used to close out my little talks for the service clubs, all those years ago. If you care even a little, you'll see some results from it. But if you care deeply, genuinely, wholeheartedly, you can produce truly extraordinary results. Simply caring a little will earn you a little. But if you take the time to cultivate a caring character, if you allow yourself to care enough about the people around you, the work in front of you, and the life you're building, you can experience extraordinary returns in productivity, in the relationships you build, in every meaningful thing you set your hand to doing. Caring, in this sense, isn't some soft, passive feeling you either happen to have or don't. It's something you actually build, the same way you build a skill or a habit. You practice caring about the quality of your work, even on the days nobody's watching closely. You practice caring about the people around you, even the ones who haven't yet earned your full attention. You practice caring about your own growth, even when progress feels painfully slow. Over time, that practice caring becomes part of who you are, and it starts showing up in ways you never planned for, in the loyalty of the people around you, in the quality of the work you produce, in the quiet reputation you build, without ever chasing it directly. So there you have it, the 4 ifs. Life is worthwhile if you learn, gathering knowledge from your own experience and from the experience of others. Life is worthwhile if you try, taking real action even when your knees are knocking and the outcome is uncertain. Life is worthwhile if you stay, hanging in there through the difficult middle stretch of whatever you've committed to, all the way to harvest time. And life is worthwhile if you care, cultivating a character that genuinely cares enough to produce results far beyond the ordinary. I'd encourage you to sit with these 4 ideas this week. Ask yourself honestly, Where in my life am I refusing to learn something I really need to know? Where have I been afraid to try, simply because I might strike out the first few times at bat? Where have I walked away too early, right in the middle of my own summer, instead of staying through to my own harvest? And where could I care just a little more deeply? In my work, in my family, in the small daily choices that quietly shape a life. These 4 ifs aren't complicated ideas. They're simple, almost stubbornly simple. But simple isn't the same as easy. Living them out, day after day, season after season, is where the real work happens. And that work, more than anything else, is what turns an ordinary life into one truly worth living. I've carried these 4 words with me for a very long time now, through good seasons and hard ones. And I've found they hold up no matter what stage of life you're standing in. Whether you're just starting out or you've already built a career, a family, a whole life around your own choices, it's never too late to ask yourself, am I still learning? Am I still willing to try? Am I still willing to stay when it gets difficult? And do I still genuinely care? If the answer is yes to all 4, I promise you, the rest of your life still has some of its best chapters ahead of it. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and I'll look forward to talking with you again soon.